Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the discussion panel, Troubles Between the Jordan and the Sea, Israel, Palestine, in light of the recent violence. I will say just a few words of introduction and then I'll introduce the panelists. In some ways, the violent events of Bloody May in Israel-Palestine appeared to be just one more episode in a depressing and seemingly endless cycle of violence between the state of Israel and the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. This was how many talking heads, not least retired members of the Israeli military and other security organizations, presented it on Israeli media outlets. It was just another case of mowing the lawn, they suggested. In fact, however, it now seems quite clear that the events of May shook the country, as well as many conventional concepts and predictions, much more profoundly than anyone had anticipated. Most important, this last bout of violence, which included a higher degree of civil strife, especially in so-called mixed areas than for many years, showed clearly that the question of Palestine, previously sidelined by Israeli and American leaders and other observers, remains a foundation of politics and identities in this contested land. In order to begin a more substantial discussion of this issue, which I hope will continue over the next few months, we have assembled a panel of 5 renowned Palestinian and Jewish researchers who will use their expertise to analyze the recent events. The panelists will focus on the implications of these events for the future of Palestine and Israel, the politics of the two nations, academic discourse on this issue, and the role of the United States in the region. In organizing this panel, I wish to thank Professor Oren Yiftachel of Ben-Gurion University, without whose help I would not have been able to put this fantastic group together. I'd also like to thank the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs for kindly hosting this event, and especially its director, Ed Steinfeld, for his continuing generous and vigorous support, and Christy Kilgus, the logistical genius of such activities. I'm also thankful to for the co-sponsorship by Brown Center for Middle East Studies and my own Department of History. I will now briefly introduce the participants and will ask them to speak in the same order. Before I do so, I regret to announce that one of the panelists, Dr. Sarab Abu-Rabia, a sociologist and an expert on Palestinian Bedouin women and on the project of decolonizing academia, who is also involved with Palestinian student struggle in Israel, has been taken ill and will not be able to join us. We all wish her a swift and full recovery. The remaining panelists are as follows. Professor Assad Ghanem of the University of Haifa, who is also head of the board of the Ibn Khaldun Association. Professor Ghanem is a political scientist who specializes in the dynamics of the Palestinian struggle for national and human rights and is a leading voice for a one-state movement, on which he may choose to say more in his remarks. The second speaker is Dr. Dalia Scheindlin of the Century Foundation, who is a political scientist and strategic advisor, an expert in international relations, and an authority on public opinion on the conflict in Israel and Palestine. She was recently cited in a New York Times article for her views on recent events. The third speaker will be Professor Oren Yiftachel of Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, Nakab, who is a political geographer and urban planner and specializes in ethnocratic and colonial politics of land settlement. An influential voice in debates in and on Israel-Palestine, Yiftachel is a leading advocate for confederation in Israel-Palestine, about which he may choose to tell us more today. Finally, Professor Yossi Yonah, also of Ben-Gurion University, is a political philosopher and politician, as well as a well-published and admired author. one of whose novels has recently been published in an English translation as Tel Aviv Ramallah, and you can find that on Amazon. Yonah specializes in studying racism, democracy, multiculturalism, and minority politics. He also served as member of the Israeli Knesset in 2015 to 19. I will now ask each participant to speak no more than 15 minutes in the order in which they were introduced. We will then have a brief discussion within the panel and then open up to questions. Those participating in this webinar may post questions on the Q&A tab, and I will choose as many of the questions as I can and read them out to the panelists. The event will end at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time or 8:30 p.m. Jerusalem time. I'm looking forward to a lively and enlightening discussion. Thank you for attending, and let's begin. Our first speaker is Professor Ghanem.
Thank you, Omer. I hope that you will remind me before my, in 2 or 3 minutes before the end of my talk, so I will keep the time. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. I will start directly with my main argument. I think that we are in the eve of a transitional period from the concept of ending the occupation to fighting the colonial situation in Palestine, or others will choose to call it the apartheid situation. I will come at the end to this point, but I will start with 4 major points that I would like to raise here. The first one is the fact that this is a there was a historical moment in our history, Palestinian history. For the first time since '48, all Palestinians, inside the Green Line, outside the Green Line, in the refugee camps, in Gaza, in Jerusalem, they went out to the streets at the same time. And this is, I think that the last time that we did it in this kind of coordinated, it's not really coordinated, but at the same time, it was in '36, in the revolution against the British mandate and Zionist settlement in Palestine. So this is, of course, a historical moment in our history. The second thing that I would like to stress in my opening is the fact that the public and the popular struggle against the Israeli measures in East Jerusalem, including in Al-Aqsa, was the sparking moment, the sparking idea behind this public struggle against, and it starts there and it moves later to the war in Gaza, but it starts in the real public struggle against Israel and against the Israeli Judaization policies in the whole area of Palestine, Israel. There were young activists, Palestinians, from inside the Green Line, from outside the Green Line, and they were, of course, this was related to something less important in the fact that they used social media nets in order to bring to the general public, to the Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, and the international community. And there was a fight between the Israeli concept and the Palestinian concept, and I think that there was a big achievement by these Israeli Palestinian activists. In the third point that I would like to bring here is the fact that I think that, and it is clear from the new government that's going to be here in Israel starting from Sunday, that the Israeli right is getting a hegemonic point in the history of Israel. There is no real leftist agenda in Israel. It is over. I mean, including the agenda of the new government. They just declared it in the TV for half an hour, and it's clear. It is promoting the Judaization in the sea area, in Jerusalem as the entire capital of Israel forever. And this is also, the funny thing is that it is joined by an Arab party. This is also something new in the history of the conflict that we should mention in this moment. The other side, among the Palestinians, we are witnessing the collapse, the total collapse of the PLO the total collapse of the Palestinian national movement, there is no Palestinian national movement. There is Hamas government in Gaza, there is PA government and Abu Mazen, who's supported by Israel in the West Bank. Palestinians in Israel, although I just mentioned the wave of action by the young generation, and I will refer to it now, Palestinians behave politically as if they are different national groups. They are not really different national groups, but behave politically as if they are a different national groups. And secondly, I would like to say a few words about the Gaza situation. I mean, we all aware to the fact that the Gaza war was launched by the rockets by Hamas or by the Israeli attacks against Gaza, following the beginning of the events in Jerusalem, in Lyd, in Akka, inside the Green Line, and in Jerusalem in general. And here I would like to say something that I think about it. I want to write something about it. I think that in the same moment that Hamas started the war or Israel started the attacks against Gaza, this was the minute of the end of the public struggle by Palestinian, and not only Palestinian, by not many Israelis, but few Israelis who joined the effort to say it is time to start and think how to confront this situation of apartheid in Palestine. And I think that it is quite clear that we are now, after the ceasefire, 2 or 3 weeks after the ceasefire, we are going back to the same moment. From our point, from a Palestinian point of view, we are going back to the negotiation between Hamas and Fatah in Cairo. It's just stopped yesterday, and there is no any real option for reconciliation. I wrote a book in 2009. I don't know if you're aware of it. In Indiana University, where I claim there is no way for internal reconciliation, because if you have the power, you are not going to give the power, whatever the situation, if it is after election or without election. Just imagine if there will be an election and Hamas wins in the West Bank. So you think that Abu Mazen will give Hamas the power in the PA, or the opposite? That's also something that we have to think about it. And we have also to think about the situation in the Arab world. The Arab world is 1 decade after the Arab Spring. They are mainly busy with their internal problems in Iraq, in Syria, of course, in the Gulf. And there were a huge achievement by Netanyahu, bringing up at least another additional 4 Arab states to have peace agreement with Israel. And now I just heard it in the war from the previous Director General of Israeli Foreign Minister. He claimed that it is time to know that the quartet is over, the 4 forces, and Israel should initiate an Arab quartet, which is Egypt, Qatar, Emirates, and Jordan, in order to negotiate or to make mediation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I think that this is also another point to put it up in the table, and that's true. Now, Jordan, Egypt, at least Jordan, Egypt, Arab Emirates, they behave if they are part of a mediation or taking part of the mediation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The third point that I want to raise here is related to Palestinians in Israel. Actually, what we are witnessing, I'm participating in many media and press meetings, interviews, and Arab world is somehow they think about us as the heroes. As if Palestinians and Israel, they are all heroes and they confront the Israeli state. I think that it is in this, at least in the academic discussion, we should admit that there are different orientations among Palestinians and Israel. There is the main power, which is represented by the Arab Joint List, by Ayman Audi and the rest of the Joint List. They are somehow they want to keep the situation as it is, to continue with the concept 2-state solution, to continue cooperation or something of coordination with the PA, with the Abu Mazen. They want to continue to speak about coexistence inside the Green Line and going back to the coexistence, which wasn't really coexistence, but this is the main idea of the joint list. The other direction, which is represented by the Arab New Party, by Mansour Abbas, which is joining, he's joining the apartheid system. He's part of the government. He's when you are in a parliamentary system and you are joining the government, and he's already joined the government. I mean, it's going to be next Sunday. You are responsible for all the acts that are carried out by the government, which means that he's going to be responsible for the Jerusalem Israeli anti-Palestinian actions in Jerusalem. He's going to be responsible for the continuous occupation. He's going to be responsible for destroying homes, Arab homes in the Raqqa and in the Galilee. So this is a historical thing. I think that we should think carefully about it. It is not an episode. I don't think that it is something that only represented by Mansour Abbas. Unfortunately, from my point of view, there is a public support for this kind of orientation, political orientation. The third and the new kind of political orientation was represented by these young people that went out in the mixed cities, and not only in the mixed cities, in every Arab village. There were demonstrations against Israeli steps in Jerusalem, in Al-Aqsa, before the war in Gaza. So this is something, a new wave of political action, political activists who want to be more connected with the Palestinian cause, with the Palestinian general Palestinian case, which brings together all Palestinians together to think, or maybe in the future, it might be that Palestinians have to think together how to come up with a solution to the general situation of the Palestinians, and not only for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza or Jerusalem or the refugees. All Palestinians are in, for this new generation of young people, all Palestinians are one national group, and they should struggle jointly against Israeli domination. I want here to speak a little bit about this new generation. Just remember that 70% of this generation were born following Oslo Agreement. I mean, 70% among Palestinians in Israel were born after Oslo Agreement. 50% were born after the Second Intifada. This generation are not aware of the Green Line. They don't know. I mean, there is no discussion in Israel, including in the Arab press, about what is the Green Line. Something that when we were young, everybody spoke about the Green Line, or about the Intifada that cannot cross the, I mean, the first Intifada that cannot cross the Green Line. Nobody now speaks about the Green Line. This is an episode which is real. My daughter, she is 20 years old. She is a student at Haifa University. We speak politics every day at home. And she asked me, Daddy, what is the Green Line? What is this Green Line? I said, this is what we call it, the separation wall between the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And she said, okay, this is in order to make sure that Palestinians cannot move to the western side of the wall, and the Jews can move freely to the other side of the wall. So this new generation, they are really, I think that many of them, at least many of them, they are aware of the political domination of the Jewish Israeli domination in the whole area of Palestine. They don't differentiate really, except the fact that they see more soldiers in Nablus when we visit Nablus, but they don't really differentiate because they have the same situation in the Galilee. We live in separate localities. We cannot live in the Jewish settlements here beside our home, let's say a few kilometers from our home. This is somehow a system that they are internalized as a system that controls the whole area of Palestine. And they are, of course, many of them, they are aware of the discourse about Israeli apartheid that comes up from international reports, ENSCWA, the Human Rights Watch, the report by B'Tselem, and of course the writings of and the talks by Oren Yiftachel and many others. I mean, they are really aware of this discussion. They are very connected with this discussion, and they cannot tolerate the fact that in their homeland there is a kind of apartheid. The main weakening weakening point of this new generation is the fact they are not organized. It's contrary to the joint list, they are organized in political parties, or to the Mansour Abbas Islamic Party, which is organized in a political party, and they get resources from the state, from the Arab states, from Turkey, from elsewhere, I don't know, from Jewish community from Jewish money funds in the United States, etc. This group of a new generation are not organized. They have to take care of themselves if they want really to become a general trend, a political active trend. They should get some kind of organization, internal organization. The fourth point that I want to raise is the one that I just opened with. The fact that I think that we are in the age of paradigm change, from the ending the occupation to ending apartheid and Jewish supremacy in the whole land of Palestine. One thing which is clear, there is a total collapse of the two-state solution. It's not new. I mean, everybody here knows that there is no option of two-state solution. But many, I still hear, let's say, Shaul Arievi, he keep telling us that from the geographical point of view, there is still an option for two-state solution. And I'm keeping telling him in every occasion, it is not geography, the question, it is politics. The political situation in Palestine and Israel cannot afford any substantive process to create a kind of two-state solution. The only way is, I mean, beside the fact that there is no, in the Palestinian side, there is no government, there is no political body. There is 2, 3, 4 political bodies that compete between themselves, but there is an end for the two-state solution. I think that what we need now is to construct, and I'm involved in Palestinian groups, at least one major group that called Multaqa Palestine. We are trying to think together how to come up with a political program that gives a vision from the Palestinian side, how to reach a solution in the whole area of Palestine, how to be ready when time comes to present to the international community, to the Jewish community in Israel, to the Arab world, which is something that we have to think about it carefully. What is our vision about the future of this land? I mean, I'm not really, now I'm not active anymore in the one state group, but I believe in the concept. But we are trying to develop now in Multaqa Palestine a clear concept about how do we imagine this concept of one state, which is something, it's not only related to how we are organized as Palestinians, as one group, one national group. Tell me, Omer, from time, I'm okay? Yes, but we have to come up with a clear vision how to deal with the Jewish majority. And now, I mean, it's not a majority in Palestine, but at least the 6 or 7 million Jews, Israeli Jews in Palestine, they are my friends, part of them, they are my colleagues, we work together, we visit the same restaurants and the same commercial centers, so we need to think about them. Not all Palestinians, not all Arabs, not all Muslims are aware of, I mean, they are aware of this, but they are not really aware of the need, how to come up with a clear idea, what is their status, this Jewish community. It's not that we will give them this status, but we have to present to the public, to the international community, how do we are going to deal with this group of people. Of course, we need to come up with an idea, what is our relations as Palestinians with the Arab world. I mean, many among my colleagues, they still believe that this is an Islamic problem, Palestine, or part of the Palestinian, the Islamic world. Many still consider it as part of the Arab world, although there is a clear fact, there is no Arab nationalism today. I mean, there is no Arab in the Arab world, Arab nationalism, and there is no Arab national project. So since at least the 50s, the 60s, we have much more Palestinian project, which is since 74 at least, it is a project for part of the Palestinians and not all the Palestinians. So we need to think, and of course we need how to we need to think how to tackle international agreements and decisions. I mean, we should be aware of the 181 decision. I mean, the two-state solution. And of course, this is something we need to think about it. Although I think, personally, I think that it wasn't fulfilled. It wasn't fulfilled in 48, neither in 67, neither in 2010. So this is over. I mean, Israel destroyed the possibility of two-state solution, but still we need to think about this thing. The other thing that
I'm afraid we may need to leave some time for the other participants.
Just one sentence.
Yeah.
We need also not only to think about the vision. We need to think how we are going to reach there. What kind of struggle we as Palestinians we will initiate in order. And this brings me to my second point. I think that there is no way for Palestinians except the public popular struggle with peaceful means in order to bring the world, the international community, Palestinians, Jews, to be aware to our struggle and to our concept, how to imagine, or how to vision the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assad. And I wanted you to speak longer because unfortunately Sarab couldn't attend. But I do want to have the other panelists also have a little bit of time for their own views. So we're moving on to Dalia. Dalia, can you turn on your video?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me and thank you for hosting. And Assad, it's interesting to hear your thoughts. I was thinking about what to discuss, and we have this focus on what is called Bloody May. I may just say that when I glanced at my computer screen, I almost thought it said Bloody Mary, so a little bit of levity. But I think that the three major things that happened during May, to my mind, that were the most important, and this shouldn't surprise anybody, were, this mini war or escalation or whatever you want to call it between Israel and Hamas and Gaza, the rioting and violence between Arab and Jewish citizens in Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel. And then, of course, before both of those, the other major important event that happened in May was the collapse of Benjamin Netanyahu's mandate to form the government, which, if things go as planned on Sunday, which is a big if, but if they do move forward, we will realize in hindsight that the 5th of May, when he lost the mandate, will have been a turning point in the Israeli political leadership. And what I want to do is try to walk through how I view, basically my analytic impressions of what happened, of what we need to take away, what we need to try to learn from all of those events. So let me start with the escalation. I mean, in a way, when I was thinking about it, I was like, what do I have to say about the escalation with Gaza, with Hamas and Israel? We all knew that this was coming. I mean, it's almost like, you hate to say I told you so, but many colleagues, any intelligent observer of the situation has been saying, of course, that there will be another round in Gaza. And to be honest, I don't think too many Israelis were even surprised by it, and probably not too many people in Gaza. There should not have been any illusions that the situation sorry, I'm just looking at the message. There shouldn't have been any illusions that the situation in Gaza, is completely unsustainable. Escalation was bound to happen at some point without political progress, no matter who started it. It's only a natural situation that when you keep a population essentially under almost hermetic closure on different, in different ways with different volume of the closure, and you turn it up and you turn it down, but it's not a natural situation. And in a way, there can be no better evidence from Israel's perspective that Israel understands only force, because Hamas speaks to Israel in the language of force. When Hamas negotiates with Israel, basically by the use of force, we forgot about all the other mini escalations between 2014 and now. When Hamas wants something, it tells Israel either through negotiators or through Qatari friends or through little mini escalations, and that's when Israel responds. So it's very, it's a negative dynamic from Israel's perspective. I also think that we should not diminish that there were political considerations on the part of Hamas in this case. And I think it has a lot to do with the postponement of the Palestinian elections, the sense within Hamas that they needed to deflect mounting pressure and discontent in Gaza, which I think whether, I don't know where it would have gone, but I think they're, from what I, hear and understand, Hamas themselves were concerned that that pressure would eventually be directed against them. So there was a deflection element because they know that that pressure would not be released in the ballot box, which is where political grievances belong. And then I think that Hamas used the opportunity, to go a little further in terms of what it meant for them to lead this campaign in a way that made Hamas seem very much in control. It basically sidelined the Palestinian Authority, which is already, enjoys very, very little credibility among Palestinians, and basically positioned Hamas at the center of Palestinian leadership. I think I haven't seen post-escalation surveys, but from all anecdotal evidence, from Palestinians from all different parts, including inside Israel and in the West Bank. And I've even heard anecdotally about longtime Fatah supporters who basically felt like Hamas were the big heroes because they stood up to Israel. And I don't know if that will last. That is the kind of sentiment that in polling often goes down after a war. But I have a sense that Hamas had an achievement that went beyond simply deflecting pressure from within Gaza or the Palestinian public and actually took center stage as a leader. With severe irony, I think there is a weird way in which, and this is completely my sense, I don't have data to prove it, that because the Israeli media was covering this dynamic so, fairly intensely, I have a feeling that Israelis have no choice but to see Hamas as a rational actor. We heard, many, many times that Hamas is just an enemy that wants to destroy Israel, but I think that there was sufficient, attempts to analyze and strategize what could be Hamas's strategy in all this in the context of the Palestinian elections and in the context of all the dynamics we're talking about, that I think if there's a weird sort of ironic outcome, I have a feeling that Israelis have become accustomed to seeing Hamas as a rational political actor. It doesn't mean they like them anymore, but for what that's worth. There are only two reasonable conclusions from the situation, from what happened in Gaza in my reading of it. One is that there will always be cyclical escalation as long as there is not a political resolution. And when I say political resolution, I mean on two levels, in terms of internal Palestinian politics and in terms of political framework between Israel and the Palestinians that provides for a sustainable and free Palestinian life, so that there is a normal sense of livelihood and opportunity and self-determination. If we don't get to those two kinds of political resolutions, we will not ever be free of the cycle of cyclical escalations of the kind we just saw. The other obvious conclusion here is I think that we can never forget that Gaza is at present a humanitarian catastrophe, which contributes to the situation and exacerbates it. It is now worse. It is worse after every war, and it needs to end with or without an escalation. I'm just using the opportunity of the recent war to remind everybody that we can never cope with this. We can never take responsibility for this region by forgetting in between wars that Gaza is a humanitarian disaster. And it also makes it extremely easy, I think, for this kind of discontent to become violent. Moving on to the second aspect I want to discuss, which is the violence inside Israel. Let me just also say that I think it was unprecedented. I don't know if anybody would disagree with that, but people have said to me, well, there have been violent demonstrations in Israel before. I mean, during the second Intifada, we had, Arab Palestinian citizens that demonstrated and clashed with police, and the police killed 13 of them. We know that. But what's different, there have always been, Jewish demonstrators who clashed with police, Arab demonstrators who clashed with police. But we did not have civilian on civilian violence between Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel for the purpose of attacking the other side. So that was very much unprecedented. And I think that, to my mind, again, this is my analysis, the important thing that I took away is that the sources of violence committed by both sides were very different. And so in the tricky question of, was it symmetrical, and the frankly desperate attempts on the part of the Israeli public to try to count who did more of the violence, I think the point is not this grim quantification, but the reality that the circumstances leading to the violence were completely different on the two sides. And I would say, if I can give a quick characterization of how I read it, the Jews who were committing violence, who were, gangs roaming the streets saying horrible things and attacking Arab Palestinian civilians and shops. These were people who were manifesting classic ethnic hostility and even hatred. They have been participating in and receiving incitement, flat out incitement from the government, from government figures, individual government figures, including at times Netanyahu, over the course of a decade. This comes directly from the top. There was a lot of attempt to blame social media, but I think that lets off the hook the fact that mainstream politicians were participating in this. And of course, to the extent that many of the people doing this violence were actually people who came in from settlements in the West Bank, they had another element in place, which is a basic condition of any ethnic conflict, and that is access to arms. Many of these are armed militias, and we can only consider ourselves lucky that they didn't bring automatic weapons or they didn't use automatic weapons. But I think it is a very threatening situation because many of the people, those who came in from places like Yitzhar, very extremist settlements, absolutely have weapons, and if this happens again, could use them. In terms of the violence that was committed by Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, I see it as the outburst of people who have been excluded from society for decades, alienated, told decade after decade with an accelerating intensity that this is not their country. They've been, pushed out, and of course, the aspect of Palestinian national solidarity that led to the demonstrations prior to the escalation, I see that as a little bit different. I'm not sure how directly connected it was to the rioting we saw in mixed cities. I just don't know, and I've been trying to understand that connection this whole time. I welcome input from others, but of course that played a part in the demonstrations. But the demonstrations before the escalation with Gaza were mostly peaceful as far as I know, and they certainly were not targeting Jews. So I do distinguish that a little bit. But of course, the marginalization over the years has led to all sorts of flourishing of criminal elements and gangs, including illegal weapons. So we have two armed communities who are not well controlled by the Israeli legal law enforcement. That brings me to the one thing the two communities share that I see as undergirding this violence that we saw in May. And that is a rebellion or a lack of authority of the rule of law in Israel. In that sense, I equate some of what happened in May to something like January 6th in the US, okay? Because there was no sense of fear or of even compliance with the rule of law or expectation that the law would have anything to do with it. But there's a difference here too, okay? I think if we look at the Arab Palestinian experience as citizens of Israel, they are below the law. They are not well served by the law. They are not well served by the police over the years. So they fall victim to a society that has to make its own laws. And that's where you have the flourishing of illegal weapons and gangs. The settlers are in the opposite situation. And I don't want to blame it only on settlers. Some of the violence was from Jewish Israelis inside the mixed cities, but we do know that a lot of the most extreme stuff was people who came in from the settlements. The point is that particular community feels themselves to be above the law, because as far as their lives are led in the West Bank, in settlements, the law, the IDF and the police and the special forces are there to serve them. And they don't feel themselves to be restricted or restrained by security services. So I think that dynamic played out very prominently on the streets, where we saw the Jewish gangs kind of acting with impunity, sometimes with law enforcement standing right beside them. So they're coming from slightly different places, but I do think that it's important to realize that I think what we saw represents a severe deterioration in the authority of law enforcement in Israel related to the deteriorating position of the judiciary at large. When you have a situation where the police have been the target of attacks, rhetorical attacks for the most part, but very severe rhetorical attacks coming from the top, okay, coming from the prime minister, coming from prime minister supporters, but not only the police, the state prosecutor, the attorney general, the Supreme Court, the entire judiciary, which is responsible for interpreting and implementing the law, has been undermined, and it didn't start with this political cycle. It's been going on for, I count it to the last 12 years, the last, pretty much since Netanyahu came to power, but accelerating significantly over the last 5 years and over the last 2 years since Netanyahu has been under indictment, that we are starting to feel the effects of that in a very material way, okay? So I think that we should all be very aware that the precarious situation of the judiciary in Israel is going to bode poorly if it's not fixed. both for Israeli society and whatever Israeli society becomes, one state, two states, confederation. We need a strong judiciary that is not the target of these populist attacks and attempts to erode their position and constrain their influence. So, having said all that, I do think that the part of this conversation that has to do with violence between the two communities, I think there might be an opportunity. As grim and painful as this month was, the opportunity is that, starting with what I'm going to venture to predict, that I don't think we're going to see a real resurgence of ethnic violence inside Israel in a significant, widespread way. I hope I'm right. I hope I'm not going too far with the prediction that I don't think we're going to see another severe mass outbreak of citizen on citizen violence for various reasons, which we can talk about maybe in the questions. But I think that it will shock people. I'd like to think that it will shock people into realizing that we have a long-term problem. We need to analyze the reasons behind the violence on both sides. And we can't wait another minute because we're really facing a danger zone. Maybe somewhat by contrast to Assad, I think that having a Palestinian Arab Party in the government, I think it is an opportunity. I mean, it's very difficult. It's very troubling. This government is, very, very complex, and certainly not the government that I hope for. Even as a political scientist, nobody can be happy about a government that is led by somebody who got 6% of the vote. But I do think that Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel will take a pause from their outbursts to say, could we see progress through the political system? Should we wait before undertaking more dramatic activities and see if the political system can offer us some sort of answers? I don't know, but that brings me to the third and final part of what happened, of my analysis of what happened in May. Well, actually, no, I do want to say one more thing, which is that
we
I'll finish up.
Just have one more minute.
Great. Okay, perfect. That's perfect. So the one last bit of opportunity is that if we do start working on fixing the problems that led to this intercommunal violence, let's say, the mixed nature of our cities in Israel and towns in Israel is only going to grow. No matter what solution we're looking for, I agree with Assad, we're not talking about a two-state partition anymore. So if we start the process now, we may eventually get there. And the last thing I will say about the government is that maybe I'm a cockeyed optimist, but I'd like to think that the very shock that I talked about with relation to citizens experiencing this violence, that maybe some of the more provocative and dangerous and incitement-filled figures of the government will maybe also be a little bit chastened and realize that if they really want to show they can govern differently, they have to start governing differently and really, work towards cooperation and compromise rather than continuing the populist, nationalist incitement that has been going on here for the last 12 years and more than that, but in recent times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dalia. And the most optimistic thing here is the birds in the background.
It's that hour.
Sing song there, yeah. Thank you. And Oren, please turn on your video, and it's your turn.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for the Watson Center for organizing. It's an opportunity for us also to have a dialogue among us and, of course, with the American audience, and we're very looking forward to your reaction. My contribution will take you to a geographical journey, and of course intertwined with all the other forces. The first point I want to make as a preliminary point is that for the first time maybe in history, the copywriter of the army that gives usually very laundered and pretty names for awful and ugly operations actually hit the nail on the head, because the guardian of the walls is actually what happened during the Bloody May events. But his intention was guarding the Jewish walls, and I actually interpret it as guarding the walls of the Palestinian ghetto. And this eruption of events and the way we can sort of connect the dots in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Lod, in Akka, in Beersheba too, actually had a similar pattern of the states trying to impose its control on various types of ghettos and enclaves, and Palestinians trying to resist it, and with implications that are confusing quite often, as people already said, this wasn't a straightforward another cycle of Gaza-Israel violence. It wasn't an intifada. Unprecedented, as Dalia was mentioning, unprecedented events in the Israeli cities. I would like to call them binational cities, not mixed cities. Mixed cities sounds as if, you know, they're supposed to be one identity and there's something mixed in them, but they are actually cities of Palestinians and Jews. So the overall may sort of highlights the idea, and then Assad Ghanem was saying, you know, perhaps it's a shift in the understanding of people. What are we at? What kind of struggle? What kind of possibilities? What kind of horizons are possible? Of course, beyond the grief of, I think, 240 dead in Gaza, 66 of them children, and the 10 Israelis, or people that died on the Israeli side, not all of them Israelis, which is not totally unnecessary violence that people pay a real price for it. I think the events actually, again, if you connect the dots, expose what I call the pangs of apartheid. That is what apartheid looks like in various forms, whether it's Northern Ireland or Bosnia or Sudan or South Africa, when one group is trying to impose its supremacy, and of course the other group or groups resist it, this kind of eruptions happen. This is what it looks like. And I think that exposes the regime that we are entering already in the last 2 or 3 decades, but it's becoming more and more apparent. And so I want to take you through 3 key terms in the 10 minutes or so that I have. One of them is the ghetto. The other one is violence, and the third one is resistance. So for that, as a geographer, I'll need to show you a few maps. Share screen. So Guardians of the Ghetto Walls. I'd like to start for the American audience to show you, you know, the reaction of the hegemony of the hegemon, total contrived panic. This is about a week ago. An incredible clip that Netanyahu filmed, literally standing with his back to the sea, you know, talking about the new government that will neglect and risk Israel. But he just presided over the destruction of big parts of Gaza. He was threatening an attack of Iran. Israel is controlling the whole Palestinian people, and he's standing with his back to the sea. You know, so the other discourse that is happening now, very much because of Mansour Abbas and because of the support that he gets from my region, from the south, that this new government will lose the Negev, the Nakab. And this is a title from, you know, the Bedouins have taken over the Negev. They actually reside on about 3.5% of the Negev. This is just to put it in perspective, but they are taking over the Negev. So this panic actually is attempting to hide the ghettoization of the Palestinians. It's attempting to hide the opposite of what's happening. And this is, if you like, just a brief illustration on the left. It's a 1947, the Jewish control of land. And on the right is the situation today. The white symbolizes Jewish and Israeli land. At the time, it was 6% of the land on the left, and now it's 96% inside the green line and about almost 50% in the West Bank. You see the Judaization of the lands of various things. Yeah?
What is the yellow color?
You can see the map, right?
Yeah, sure. What is the yellow? I ask you, what is the yellow color?
The arrows?
Yellow.
The green is Palestinian land, Palestinian control in various ways, and the white is Israeli or Jewish. No time for all these details, but the process of colonization is very, very obvious. Then if we look at Jewish settlements, look at it. This is how I opened my new book, with this one page. And I said, how is it that so few people write about Israel-Palestine as a colonial situation? Look at 1917, 67 Jewish settlements. Last year, 1,178. This is an ongoing process, although it's slowed down a bit in recent years, but it's an ongoing process of massive apparatus of land confiscation, settlement, and of course, all this is controlling. And the opposite is that if we look at 1947, Palestinian geography is 911 localities, 11 cities. And after the Nakba in 1953, we see whole areas that are actually marked here as ethnically cleansed. And in fact, since 1953, which is the end of the eviction of the Bedouins, and also people like Ashkelon, etc., the Palestinian geography has been frozen. The population has grown a great deal, but it's been frozen. There's very, very few new settlements, most of them to concentrate Bedouins and other Falahin people, and that is the ghettoization. You see the two processes, Jewish expansion, Palestinian freezing, and the population, as we can see in that graph, is about equal. About 7 million Palestinians, 7 million Jews, under one government at the moment that controls in various ways the different enclaves and ghettos, and under one court and one army, etc., etc. Assad Ghanem explained that very well. Skip forward is when you have two populations with different rights, different types of citizenships, ghettoized as it is. The Palestinians in Israel are ghettoized into 3% of the land, although they are 20% of the population. The Palestinians in the West Bank are 85% of the population. They ghettoized into about a third of the West Bank. Then you have this process of what I call creeping apartheid. And this is my recent book in Hebrew, just came 2 months ago. It's called Power and Land from Ethnocracy to Creeping Apartheid. But this is, I found the first article that wrote about it in year 2000. So Assad and I and other people have been actually working on it for a long time. It's become apparent, and sadly so. And this, in what happened in the binational cities, is one expression of it, because there is various way of Judaization. For example, gentrification by major capital is usually bringing Jews to Palestinian areas, like in Jaffa, in Akka, near the sea. In other more impoverished places, it's neglect and poverty and lack of housing. And this created, as we said, scenes of violence down here. It's Ramla. I focus on the Negev because very few of you, because Sarab is not here, that also there was unprecedented violence by the Arabs of the Negev against property, against people. Luckily, nobody was killed, but it was also unprecedented in a way. And in our campus, I mean, people here in Brown University, there was major violence in the Ben Gurion University campus, also for the first time. There was a scene that actually is online, if you want, in YouTube, in Justice for Our Students, that kind of clip. You'll see a George Floyd kind of incident where 4 police people went on one Arab demonstrator that all basically, they had a peaceful demonstration. They were attacked by Jews, Kahanists, something about 200 people. You can see some of the events right in the campus, in the dorms, and this again turned the situation, I think, as Assad described, and also Dalia, as something that haven't happened before. And look at what happens in the Bedouin areas here. Is the right is the plan for metropolitan Beersheba. Look how pretty it is, agriculture and tourism, but on the left, this is the aerial photographs. You see all these, about 120,000 people that are called unrecognized. And the government is trying in a campaign to push them into towns and localities. And this frames the situation. In the first of the 4th election, there was a minister, there was a plan that the government launched, and it says here, the state will resettle 125,000 Bedouins in 3 years. This is the plan for Israeli citizens, Arab Israeli citizens in the south, to be ghettoized formally. An incredible amount of house demolition, 10,640 houses were demolished in the last 5 years. It's 6 times more than in the West Bank, and how much smaller the population is, and 10 times more than the rest of Israel, just in the Beersheba region. So this, of course, is more extreme than elsewhere, but it actually illustrates a system of ghettoization. So, and that's what it looks like some places around Beersheba. So I hope I impressed you that there is a very strong geography to it. And this is the term that I wanted to stress. This is a long process. Now, very briefly about violence. Of course, we saw violence on both sides, and it's a bit confusing. But I want to say that the state violence is actually a long-term, what we can call hegemonic or slow violence. That is violence you don't see all the time. It's in the courts, it's in the planning, it's in immigration regime, it's the hidden violence, and the minority violence, the peripheral violence is actually erupts because they have no other means. I'd like to say that, first of all, of course, as a person, as a human rights person, I condemn it. And I think also it's politically disastrous. But if we understand the roots of it, we see the state unseen violence. And I don't totally concur with Dalia here. I think the state is very powerful, and the fact that it sort of loses control, it's also strategic. It's not something that, it cannot control. Sometimes it allows things to happen, like illegal construction, in order to have an enemy, in order to have a frontier. A colonial state needs a frontier, and of course, it's not totally planned. It's not like there are some unplanned consequences, but the state is very powerful. The Israeli state is very, very powerful. Not that it doesn't fail, but its violence is over 73 years is amazing. To contain the people on, say, 10% of the land, to contain 50% of the people on 10% of the land, it's an amazing institutionalized, legalized, economic kind of violence, while telling telling the world that it's a democracy. So I want to refer to Mustafa Dikic's recent book, which is called Urban Rage, which surveys minorities, usually Black and Muslim minorities around the world, and we see quite a similar phenomenon is in Israeli binational cities. Now, the third term is resistance, and I think it's incumbent upon us to think, like Assad said, with the Multaka Palestine, that I think I was the first Israeli actually to speak there. How do we sort of equip ourselves with the loss of the two-state solution, the partition that has failed for 74, 75 years, and rethink the strategies? And paradoxically and sadly, but we can see that violent resistance actually has the opposite results. Violent resistance quite often strengthens the ghetto. It gives legitimacy to the apartheid state to use its own violence, which is 10 times stronger. And not just the violence, like Dalia said, of people armed or not armed, but all these other apparatus that makes it very, very difficult. Or, like Assad said, very sophisticatedly, to integrate some of the groups of the Palestinians, of the oppressed, within the system. This is what I call the colorization of the Arabs in Israel. They become like the colored people in South Africa that become sort of in between the Black people and the white people, and they have some crumbs of the regime's power, but of course they're part of the system. I can see that Professor Bartov is telling me one more minute. So I think we really do have to think about different strategies, and the different strategies are, if we want to have a democratic, stable, prosperous horizon, we need to break the ghetto walls. We need to have equality of the two people. We need to have what I call gradual, multifaceted, multiscalar binationalism. We live in a binational reality between the Jordan and the sea, and it's not going to change. So I'd like to give a little plug to our peace movement, a land for all, 2 states, 1 homeland. When we talk about confederation of 2 sovereign areas according to international law, but states that are open and freedom of movement, and Jerusalem as a joint capital, and to dismantle the whole idea of one group controlling the other, but also to dismantle the fear. And like Assad was saying, the place of the Jews in the Middle East is also unsecured, a lot because of Israel's policy, but also because of Jewish history. There is very, very troubled, a nation that suffered genocide just 1.5 or 2 generations ago. So in that respect, binationalism, which is mutual recognition, the Palestinians recognize the Jews recognize the Palestinians, and a confederation kind of institutional structure for us, for our movement, and you're all welcome to look Land for All on the Facebook and on internet, etc. But I said there's many other organizations, and the focus should be on how we don't go back. A lot of people say, let's go back to normal. Let's go back to routine. No, that routine caused the eruption, caused the violence. So we need to rethink beyond that and how we break the walls of the ghetto metaphorically and physically, and have two peoples living in equality in various places, in cities, in campuses, in workplaces. This should be the major intellectual project and of course political project for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oren. And we're moving now to the final speaker, to Yossi. And I'll tell people who are listening to this that we will not have a panel discussion afterwards, but we'll open right away to questions after Yossi speaks, because we want to people to have a chance to ask questions. So Yossi, the floor is yours.
Well, first I want to thank those responsible for organizing this meeting and for inviting me to take part in it. Omer, Christy, and Watson Center, and Oren, of course, and I'm very glad to be here with you. Now, I want to begin with kind of a disclaimer and apology. Unlike some of the participants in this debate and who have articulated a detailed solution proposal to the lingering and bloody Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I don't have an elaborated proposal, and I'm not even familiar enough, and I apologize for that, with the proposals elaborated by them. Though I was, how to put it, I was once, one of the signatories of the Geneva Initiative, so I guess that entitles me to be one of those, who propose some kind of solution in the past. And yet, I do believe that any solution to the conflict should be grounded in the following three basic principles. Now, first, it requires radical equality between Jews and Palestinians. Second, it requires mutual recognition of the right to self-determination on the land, meaning Israel, Palestine. And third, the solution should be comprehensive, all-encompassing, in the sense that it relates to diaspora Palestinians, Gaza Palestinians, the West Bank Palestinians, and of course, Israeli Palestinians, Arabs of 48. Now, the third principle, including especially Israeli Palestinians in any future solutions, I look further logical and necessary given what unfolded during the last cycle of violence called by official Israel, Shomrei HaChomot, the guardians of the walls, and by Hamas, Seif al-Quds, the Jerusalem sword. Playing an important role in mobilizing them, Hamas was successful in augmenting the sense of common national identity and interest, uniting Israeli Palestinians with their brethren, wherever they are, though with all, of course, the differences that Assad Ghanem was pointing out. Now, but all the logical and maybe necessary, it does not mean that any solution proposal grounded in this principle is viable or feasible under current conditions. And this is, I want to iterate Hume's, if you wish, David Hume's distinction between is and ought. And I'm talking about the oath. Okay, these are the three principles that should guide any fair and just future solution. But then when we're considering the is, meaning the political conditions under which we live, well, there is still a large disparity between the guiding principles that I'm stating and the viability of such principles. And now the problem, as I said, is not the lack of logical and reasonable solutions to Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The problem is that there is no political will to promote them neither here nor there, adding to it the lack of mutual trust of each other, Jews and Palestinians. Now, let us consider Israeli public views concerning the two-state solution, which is not as forthcoming solution as the three principles stipulate. The majority of Jewish Israelis support this solution, yet at the same time, they believe that there aren't any serious and trustworthy Palestinian partners who are willing to endorse it. Now, we all know the main engineer of this political reality, of this widespread perception, as we all know, is Ehud Barak, who once was the leader, what I call the sanguine Israeli left. And I want to be very careful and to say that following the last round of violence, and here I'm not, I guess that I beg the difference from the optimistic sentiment expressed by Dalia here, but whether there is some kind of silver lining, over these darky cloud. Well, many Israeli Jews may emerge even more skeptic about the availability of this solution, let alone willing to consider more progressive, and I mean skeptic about the two-state solution, and let alone willing to consider more progressive ones. But even prior to the last round of violence, the forces resisting peaceful reconciliation with the Palestinians were gaining sway over Israeli society and Israeli politics. Serving as a member of parliament a few years ago, I objected vehemently, along with my many other colleagues in the parliament, to the intention of the right-wing government to pass the national law, basic law, Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people. Now, the law aims to further secure the Jewish character of Israel at the expense of its democratic character. Particularly, the law abolished, among other things, the status of Arabic as an official language of the land. It stated that, and I quote, the national language is Hebrew, end of quote, but it preserves, and again, I quote, a special status in the state, end of quote, to Arabic language, not official language. We failed, as you all know, we failed in our attempts to forestall the legislation. 62 members voted in favor of the law, 55 against, and 2 abstentions. Now, aside from cynical and populist considerations, and I do agree with the analysis, especially the Dalia was presenting here, that the use of incitement and instilling fears in the Israeli public. But I'm saying, aside from cynical and populist considerations, the law also indicates the fact, whether justified or not, that many Israeli Jews feel insecure in their homeland, feeling that they need to consolidate their hold on the state. Their feeling reverberates, of course, Brubaker's depiction of ethnic nationalism, owning its origins to fear and anxieties, the threat, real or imagined, of possible annihilation. These feelings intensified, of course, during the last round of violence. Now, my friend Oren, of course, made reference to this point, the Holocaust and the repercussions of the Holocaust and the Israeli public psyche and so forth and so on. And I want to share with you an anecdote. Actually, following the end of the cycle of violence, I was supposed to go to the north to visit my sister Friday evening's dinner. And okay, so I said I'll be there, around 7 o'clock evening time. I answered okay, and then half an hour later she called and she said, "No, don't leave at night." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Don't leave at night because you have to pass through Paradis and Jisr al-Zarqa, and you're going to be stoned on your way." I said, "My sister, what the hell are you talking about? What do you mean I'll be stoned?" She said, "Yes, you don't know in the writing now." And I was thinking about it, and believe it or not, at the end of the day, I left at 5 o'clock afternoon. There was no stone throwing. But this is just kind of giving you the feeling what actually is happening, and of course it is not. I'm sharing with you a sense of anxiety and fear without trying to. I agree with what Dalia was saying and what Oren was saying, and the way that they're analyzing the disparity, the inequality, and I liked very much the distinction Dalia made between above the law and under the law, and that it's a good depiction of the situation. Now, as to the sentiments widely spread within Palestinian society, they're of course of different nature, experiencing uprootedness, dispersion, calamities of cruel occupation. Many Palestinians are led to be similarly entrenched, like many Israeli Jews. And I hear reverberations coming from rhetoric of Palestinian leaders, especially Hamas leaders, indicating that they view the conflict as a zero-sum game. Now, of course, it might be a kind of starting bargaining, position, but nonetheless. And the rhetoric says, well, the Jews should leave and go to countries from which they came. Well, now personal point. Well, my parents were born in Iraq, and I have to admit that I do feel strong affinity to Iraq. I do feel strong affinity to Iraq, but I don't wish to live there. And I don't think that there aren't many people who would welcome me there should I show interest to live there, especially now. Well, this kind of rhetoric, Hamas rhetoric, of course, serves in return Israeli right-wing leaders. And I think that goes along with, in a way, with what Oren was saying, that, there's kind of manufacturing of violence, so that you can mastermind violence so that it would be conducive to your goals and interests. So again, this kind of rhetoric serves Israeli right-wing leaders who are not only celebrating it in a way, no partner to peace agreement, but feel emboldened to go ahead with the settlement project in the West Bank. So here we are, entangled in an intricate web of expansionist aspirations, embraced by extremists from both sides. And I'm aware, of course, that unlike the Palestinian, Israel has an advantage of living up to these aspirations as the settlement project goes on, even if it will not continue in full steam should the new coalition government see the light of day. So I'm not all that sanguine as to the possibility of making a meaningful progress towards a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict under current conditions. Both Jews and Palestinians are not ready. They're not ready. They're not ready yet. And I remember the chilling observation once made by James Baker, the Secretary of State and Reagan's and Bush's administration. He was expressing frustration following his failed attempts at reaching a solution to the conflict. And he said, well, Jews and Arabs are not ready yet. So let them bleed. Here's my phone number. They may call me when they are ready. And the bleeding has not stopped since then. Now, let me sum up my tentative thoughts on this tragic entanglement. There are two ways to proceed, not necessarily mutually exclusive. One is to force a solution on the feuding sides. We need a nanny. We need a nanny, an international nanny, the international community, to pull both sides by the ear and make them sit and negotiate at the negotiating table and force them to reach an agreement, consistent more or less with the three principles I stated above. Second, we, people who aspire to reach such an agreement, Palestinians and Jews alike, need to continue making efforts aimed at establishing a shared cultural and even emotional infrastructure. And I don't mean just, come up with visions with another proposal. Binationalism, confederation, one state, and well, I welcome these kind of proposals, but there is an infrastructure that it is needed so that there would be seemingly even available. And I mean, emotional or cultural infrastructure through the art, literature, music, film, what have you. This is needed so we may be able to build mutual trust or dispel fears and prejudices. This infrastructure is needed so Jews and Palestinians may be able to view each other in different light and to facilitate willingness of both sides to move towards a reconciliation consistent with the three principles I stated before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yossi. Great. And thank you for all your comments. Since I don't right now, I'm hoping that our audience will post some questions. I don't see any posted questions yet. So to start us off, I just want to present you with all of you, whoever wants to chip in, with the following question. My own sense has been that what we saw in May was in a sense too contradictory developments. One was that it became clear, I think, to many observers that the attempt of the state of Israel to, as many, as Oren would say, as many colonial states would do, to cut up the group that it controls in one way or another into separate groups failed. That is, that Palestinians who were in Gaza and Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians who were in Israel were seen to be the same group. They seem to be responding one to the other in a way that clearly indicated that that attempt had failed. And we knew that before, but I think it was illustrated very well during those weeks. But the second was that the response to the unprecedented violence within the mixed or the binational cities, however we call them, and the ongoing response to that until today has been also that many people were coming out and saying, we have to find a way to live together, that we have to understand that no one is moving out, that we are all staying here together, and we haven't found a way to do that. And I think that this, I'm wondering if any of you feel that while those weeks of May were so terrifying and so dark, there is a way of thinking about it differently. That is, that there was a sense that there is a need, a dire need, an urgent need to find a way that hasn't been found to accept the fact that everyone has to accommodate the other, that there is no other way of living in that reality without constant recurring violence. So that's my question to you, and I'm going to add one more question to that, which is coming from one of our listeners, and the question is, does any of the panelists support the right of Israel to exist and a two-state solution? So anyone who wants to jump in on either questions, please do so. Yes, Dalia, please.
Okay, thank you. I have a few comments. First, a couple of very small responses. Just to clarify, I'm not sure if I would characterize my view as optimistic after what happened in May, more like trying to find an opportunity for what we can do from it, maybe looking too hard for opportunities, but that's my point. Another point also to Yossi, when you say the majority of Israelis support a two-state solution, not by my polling, not anymore. The number of, as of our last Israeli-Palestinian joint survey in September of 2020 was 44% of Israelis support it. And the number actually was surprisingly not that different between Jewish and Palestinian citizens because of a big drop in support among Palestinians, although it's still higher among Arab Palestinian citizens than among Jews. Other surveys have slightly different numbers, but we're all seeing the same decline over time. So keep that in mind. I've seen numbers that were lower than that, by the way, in other surveys. In terms of the question about the failure,
it is even more depressing then.
yeah.
More depressing findings, because
yeah. In terms of the question that Omer raised about whether Israel failed in terms of trying to divide Palestinians in terms of a colonial enterprise, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to weigh in on it, but it seems not, right? I mean, the more I think Palestinian citizens in Israel become empowered, educated, moving into the middle and upper middle classes, the more they seem to embrace a Palestinian identity. And so obviously it doesn't, I'm not sure why this is a surprise. In other words, national identity never goes away. Like, it surprises us every time, but it shouldn't, because the Jewish people held on to their national, pre-national identity for 2,000 years. But I do want to go to the question about whether we can find a way to live together in the cities. Omer, your second question about, we realize that it's not working. I think we need to call that into question. I mean, I'm certainly the last person to do like Israeli hasbara, but I think there are factual realities that every day is not like what we saw in May. There are, there's an overwhelming portion of the time that is spent with peaceful, positive, and progressive interactions which hides beneath the surface grave inequalities, of course, and state violence, which my colleagues talked about. So those are realities. And that's why I say the thing to do is not to assume we can't live together and it's not working, because we do live together, even under a situation of severe inequality and state, violence and pressure for decades. And yet, for the most part, the vast majority of interactions are not violent, and in fact, often quite constructive. And so I think we need to, acknowledge what we do have going for us and leverage that. In terms of the question about does any of us support Israel's right to exist? Of course, I support Israel's right to exist. I do not support policies of structural inequality. In terms of the two-state solution, I do not support the old version of a two-state solution that was negotiated and conceptualized 21 years ago and is no longer relevant on the ground. And in fact, having criticized it, I think I came to critique it more deeply and realized that it really was not the right solution. Therefore, I'm with Oren and maybe other people here. I support a two-state confederation, two sovereign states with a more open and cooperative mode of interaction, sharing certain sovereign powers, which I think is the only humane, feasible, and maybe, yes, optimistic approach.
I wonder, yes, Assad, I wonder if you could respond to this. I just want to add one thing before you respond. I spent many years studying interethnic communities, but not in Israel-Palestine. And what one sees is that communities can live side by side for a long time peacefully, and yet there's a trigger that can create a great deal of violence. So the fact that Jews and Palestinians are living in communities together, and most of the time there's no violence, but there are eruptions of violence, and this was unprecedented since 1948. But why does that happen is, I think, a question that we have to consider. Assad, please.
Yes, actually, I have a few comments. I think that thinking about Lid, what happened in Lid, I wrote an article in Haaretz. When you see that there is young people in Lid, they demonstrate against whatever you want, discrimination, separation, apartheid, whatever. But in the same day, I saw the mayor of Lid. I saw him in the TV. He says, I invited these settlers to protect the Jews. So he said it clearly. He's an official. Just think that the mayor of Al-Fahim will say in the TV, I invited the Shabib of Fatah to protect Palestinians in just to illustrate what kind of system. It is not only in the public sphere, but also in the upper structure of how this state is, how this is run, or how this is how it works. But just to think about the people that demonstrate, I don't agree that these are criminal people. I mean, this is one way of the official Israeli media to say this is not the common situation. I do agree with this. I mean, I am aware to the fact that we are in the end of the concept that we grew up to demonstrate, the equality between Jews and Arabs and coexistence and etc. and two-state solution. As I said before, I'm not saying that we're already in the new paradigm, but we are moving toward the new paradigm. These young people are the pioneers of the new situation that I would like to see. I hope that it will come, because I think that there is no two-state solution for any kind of two-state solution. But let's leave it. I wrote my first article about the end of the two-state solution in 1996. 1996. Following a report by Shalom Achshav, when they declared, I don't know if you remember the report, that they found that under Rabin government, the construction, the settlements were more than under Shamir government. I don't know if you remember, but then I said, okay, there is no way for two-state solution as we Palestinians imagine it, the two-state solution according to the international community resolutions. So this is also something, but these people, among Arabs in Israel in general, but in Lid in particular, the way that Israel tried to expel, to take out Palestinians in East Jerusalem from their homes, these people came from Jaffa and Lid in East Jerusalem. So it reminds them somehow in the concept of ethnic cleansing in 48. And this reminds also all Palestinians. I mean, it reminds me how states act violently in order to make ethnic cleansing gradual, whatever excuses, but at the end, this is the situation. The other thing that it is clear, and it is somehow very important in Palestinian narrative, is Jerusalem. Jerusalem, which is Palestinians in Jerusalem, but also Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is not only a religious symbol, it's a national symbol, where Israel allowed these settlers, it's not allowed, it's pushed them, it's helped them to enter to Al-Aqsa, which is symbolizes something in the national narrative, not only in the religious, but again, to what we saw in Lid, there were, let's say, 4 or 5 buses that came out from the West Bank of Kahani young people. They entered to Lid. I'm sure there is no doubt that the Israeli police can stop them. They didn't stop them. They allowed them to enter, and we saw them in the TV. This young Jewish settlers attack Arabs in the streets of Lid, and the police stands beside and try to. It's not that he helped them, but he is part of the game that allows. When these two communities clash together, this is the explosion of the system. This is something that gives us an idea what will happen if there will be no change. What is the situation that I do agree that mostly Arabs in Israel, the normal way of life is that we work together, we shop together, we whatever. But this is a it is a situation where it is clear for me and for the new generation that there is Jewish supremacy. It's not only by law. It is my right to live here in Carmel. Do you remember this before 5 years when the Arabs bought apartments in Carmel, and it was cancelled because the what his name? The Karen Kayemet said this is the Jewish land. This is Jewish land that were confiscated from Arabs. I learned it from Oren Yiftachel, and then it moved to be a property of the Karen Kayemet, and Arabs cannot live there. What is this? So I think that, you know, including Arabs who vote for the Likud, I'm sure that 90% of the Arabs, they are aware to this system. So the question, who takes the risks? Who is ready to go out and to confront the system? And this is something very important, including in South Africa, where all the blacks, they took part in the struggle against the apartheid. Maybe it's 10%, 5%, 20%, but these are the pioneers that did the way towards the future. One last thing, I think that we need to think about this guy, Ben Gvir. I want to assure you, I don't know what will happen in the future. I assume that in the next Knesset election, he will reach 20 seats in the Knesset. Just think about this. He's every day. I know that Yossi, he's laughing. You think that it is, you think, I mean, who think about before 10 years that the Labour will get only 7 seats? Just imagine the dynamics. He's every day, every moment. He's in the TV, promotes his ideas about in Jerusalem and elsewhere, and this is the new hero of the Israeli right.
I want to jump in. Just, we've had a number of questions, and we're running out of time. So I just want to give the panelists a chance to respond to a number of questions. So because we do have an audience that has been very patient, and I'll give a gist of 3 questions. The first is regarding the question regards Yossi's suggestion for an internationally initiated solution, the nanny, what you called. And the question is, what do participants think about the local forces that can push to reconciliation. The questioners believe that that has not worked in the past. They sort of internationally impose solutions, and therefore, what do you think about the chances for reconciliation coming from within? And continues to say that Professor Ghanem provided an important perspective on Palestinian movements. That's the first question. The second is to Dalia. Dalia highlighted the humanitarian catastrophe that exists, that has been made worse by the recent violence in Gaza. Can the panelists share their thoughts on what steps need to be taken to address this crisis and how this might be incorporated into a process of stabilizing or improving the contemporary security threshold? And the last question is to any of the panelists, and I think I would love you to respond to that. Given the realities of the dominant narrative within the United States regarding Israel-Palestine, if you had a room full of US teachers, educators, how would you encourage them to teach Bloody May? So all questions and referring to all panelists. Who would like to jump in?
Since I didn't participate in the last round, I'll take the initiative now. Very good question, thanks. And I'm glad about the last question, because this is one of the points that I wanted to raise. Hey, Israel-Palestine is not in a vacuum. Israel is part of the American empire, and this is Brown University, and we have to stress the role of the US. If you might think that, you know, Israelis and the settlers and perhaps the Hamas are the local people that generate this kind of violence and apartheid, absolutely, it's the US that does it on the international level. How can Israel have this impunity, incredible impunity? Recently, I was corresponding with a Russian political scientist, and he says indignantly, we took a small, tiny piece of the Ukraine, which is a big country, and we are under sanctions and suffering, etc., etc. You took Jerusalem, the most important city in the world, for 50 odd years, and no hair has fallen off your head. So this is the US protection. US vetoed for Israel more time than it's vetoed for the US. Can you believe that, right? So let's think about what you can do also in the US to lobby, to change. There's maybe an opportunity that Dalia probably thinks, but she didn't allude to, with the Biden administration, with Blinken, with a different kind of approach, that if they actually try to think about Palestinian sovereignty and Israeli sovereignty, they will come to a confederation, because partition now is impossible. So let's push the US not to roll off the responsibility from us. It needs to come from the outside and from the inside. We're trying, all the people here are really trying hard. So I think that's a really important point. And in terms of going back to the question of what can be done, both in Gaza and elsewhere, very quickly about Gaza and the siege and the illegal siege. You know, you can have security control, that people, armed control, don't come to Israel. This is an illegal siege by Israel and also by Egypt, about a 2 million strong population. And again, this is obviously will ease the humanitarian crisis, not resolve the apartheid, but we will ease things, and then there's a ground to continue to resolution. But finally, I think we do have, as scholars, as researchers, we have the responsibility to speak truth to power. The absolute dominant discourse is still about democratic Israel, a villa in the jungle, the only democratic state in the Middle East, etc., etc. And we have to actually describe the situation as it is, as Rosa Luxemburg taught us. If you want to resolve a situation, call the situation its real name as a foundation for progress, right? So we need to describe the disease in order to move to the cure. So we have to, I'm very proud to be one of the writers of the B'Tselem report about the apartheid. This is a beginning, you know, in order to have what a very high value of Jews. It's called tikkun olam. But you have to transform the world on the basis of what's wrong with the world. You cannot pretend that this is a beautiful liberal democracy, but you have to actually face, like you have the picture behind me. This is a situation around Beersheba, illustrating the profound inequality and a profound control of supremacy of one group over the other. And I'm sure that when the coalitions reorganize themselves, like Assad Ghanem said, and Palestinian and Jews that are for peace and for decolonizing the situation, organized together vis-a-vis the Palestinian and Jews that are for kind of status quo, you'll see new coalitions coming, and you'll see the possibility of a joint struggle, which is so important to break the apartheid.
Thank you very much, Owen. And we have run out of time. If anyone wants to jump in just for 1 minute for concluding comments, please.
Well, I agree with most of the things said by Oren, and still I have a problem with describing Israel colonial state. I would agree that there are colonial apparatus, but it is still different than colonial. Just want to note that I disagree with this depiction of Israel, and I think it is important to make this distinction between colonial apparatus and colonial state. Now, to your previous question, of course, it's obvious that I'm supporting the right of Israel, to exist. And I want to second what Dalia was saying about I don't know to call it even coexistence, because it is no longer, the right maybe even word to describe things. But I do, and personally, I have family members living in the north. It's not that that's just, living with Arabs, but they have shared business with Arabs. So there is this level, very interesting level. As long as there's this kind of again, coexistence or shared existence, yeah, well, it is there. It happens. But the moment that it is translated, and I think that Assad was making this point very clear, the moment that is translated into political views, political positions, then there is again this discrepancy. So you would see, and this is very strange, maybe it seems strange, people are actually voting even for the Likud, Jews, and on the other hand, they would engage in business ventures with Palestinians, of course, under what Assad was saying, Jewish supremacy. So it is important for me to make these points. And again, and the last point, what Oren is saying about the United States, it's very important, because I think that we are actually witnessing changes there. And what we're actually seeing, what actually is unfolding within the Democratic Party, I think, well, indeed, there is some kind of hope that maybe the United States, at the end of the day, will change its approach toward Israel. And as I was saying before, maybe playing a role in this nanny thing that I was talking about before.
Thank you. And if Dalia and Assad want to just give a 1 minute wrap up, please do.
I feel like I had a lot of time. Assad, would you like to go first?
I don't have any specific comment, but I think that what we hear from the United States, I'm not familiar. I mean, I'm not a specialist in the United States. At least there are voices, clear voices, that I try to say both aspects, that it is too late for the two-state solution, and there is a need for a solution that's based on equal rights. There was a report by Carnegie, what is it called, the Institute, that mentioned this clearly before a month. So it is also another thing that we should consider, a new generation of young Jews, Palestinians, Arabs, and others who are take the initiative in the streets of the United States, but it's not the dominant power there, but there is a new generation that really think differently about what should happen in Palestine between Jews and between Israelis and Palestinians.
Thank you, Assad. And Dalia?
I mean, I'd like to try to answer all the questions, but I won't have time. I will just say that about Gaza, which I think is really very urgent for everybody to keep in mind, that one thing we can do is just remember that Gaza exists in between wars. And, when we talk about the two-state solution or any solution or what Palestinians think, too often the conversations focus on the West Bank. And it's just accepting Israel's, divide and conquer policy. So that's the first step. But there are many practical steps that can be taken. First of all, relieving the near hermetic siege of Gaza that Israel has been maintaining since the year 2007. there's no security need for it. There may be security needs for controls over what goes in and out in terms of concrete, but what's happening is well beyond that. And all you need to do is go to the website of the organization called Gisha, and they have lots of suggestions that you will find there. In terms of how to teach this, I mean, you know, I don't want to be presumptuous, but if you take this panel and try to convey what we have conveyed, people who live here and are critical and have thoughtful analyses, and maybe take some analyses from the other side, from other perspectives as well. I think that, you know, the way to teach it is to look fearlessly at the sources of what's going on here, and not try to serve somebody's agenda. You know, I'm not sure if I have any better recommendation than that. I also appreciated the question looking at the failures of the international community in other conflicts. And, you know, I know quite a bit about some of those conflicts, especially the former Yugoslavia. You know, I want to point out that there is no perfect human society. We're never going to reach a stage where everybody loves each other and there is no violence. It just doesn't happen in the world. And we have to accept that. So when you say Yugoslavia has been a failure, even though the international community was involved, because there is still genocide denial, compared to the starting point between 1991 and 1995, I'll take it. Now, they have a lot of work to do, and they desperately need to improve the political constitutional arrangement in Bosnia, or they're going to, you know, there's a lot of building pressure, and they know it, and they need to deal with it. And I don't want to, you know, try to whitewash that. But I think we have to think of our starting point now, and think, what tools do we have by which we can do better than we are today? And if the international community can play a constructive role, that's fine. I don't expect them to solve all of our problems, but why not use them if they can play a constructive role? And yeah, the Biden administration may be, I don't know, a little ambiguous about them right now, but certainly better than the previous one. So those are my thoughts. Thank you for a very good question.
Thank you, Dalia. And I just want to say that my own impression has been, especially during this last month, that public opinion in the United States has shifted. And my sense is that this shift will continue. It is both within the Jewish community and in wider circles, and certainly in the Democratic Party. And I think that there's something to work with here, but that it needs exactly what we had here, a really well-informed panel that brings perspectives to mostly, I think, American listeners who may learn something about the complexities of this issue. I want to thank all of you very much for participating in this. To me, it was very enlightening. I hope that our listeners learned something from.
Thanks for inviting us. Thank you.
From this, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the Watson Institute, and I hope that we do this again soon. So thank you and goodbye, everyone.